In this video, we want to talk about editing and exporting UV map images we create in Blender and other software such as GIMP or Photoshop, and how we can set that up to work really quickly for us. First thing we want to do is make sure Blender knows which image editor, such as Photoshop or GIMP or something, that we want to use. So to do that, we can go to File and User Preferences, and I'll put that in full screen. And then under this File tab here, where it says Image Editor, what you want to do is select whichever program that you use. So if it's Photoshop, you would click on this folder here, browse through your computer. Typically, if you're on Windows, that's in C, and then either in this programs file 86 or this programs file or whatever, and look for Adobe or the name of whatever company that created this software you're using. And you want to just find that. And then typically you're looking for a .exe file there. Select that, press accept. And then before you exit this screen, you want to go ahead and press save user settings so that the next time you open up Blender and try to do this, it will work. Okay, let's go ahead and double right click up here and add a monkey. I'm going to press S to scale, press W a few times to give it some smoothing. I'm going to delete that default cube there. Let's go ahead and create a simple UV map for our Suzanne head. So to do that, we'll press tab to go into edit mode. Then I'm going to press shift scroll up for edge selection. And I'm going to alt select this loop of edges here that goes all the way around the face, because this lets Blender know, hey, I want you to taxidermy slice this face off so we can lay it down flat for when we want to paint on this object. And we'll go ahead and press T to bring up our tool shelf, select our edge tools, and just press mark seams, because here's all our cool UV unwrapping type stuff here. And then we want to create some seams around the ears to let the taxidermist know that, hey, we want to cut off the skin of the ears and lay them out flat this way. So we'll just shift select around and do something like this. And we can go ahead and press mark seams there. Let's go ahead and select the same thing for the other side. I'll just shift select these. Got that all around there, the same as over there. Okay, press mark seams again. Now I've got my seams all lined up on my Suzanne head here, so Blender will know how to rip the skin off and lay it down flat to create our UV map. So let's press A to select all the mesh, because we want to create a UV map for every face that exists on the object. Then just under here, press unwrap and select the basic unwrap option, which is what you want when you are using seams. So to get to the image editor, we can either manually change it here, or we can press our handy dandy edit UVs button, which is nice to have while you're working on all this stuff. So press edit UVs. And here is our basic UV map that was created for this monkey head. Notice that here in the object properties, which shows the properties of whatever object you have selected, that we now have this UV map that was generated. So this is an okay UV map. It's not perfect. Whenever you have a bunch of faces bunching together like this, such as this is where we mark the seams around the ears. So if I go ahead and switch this down to island selection, which is real nice when you're working with this stuff, because it means you can click on any set of faces that are disconnected from everything else. If we go ahead and click on one of these ears here, so I'll go ahead and close that up. Down here in our camera area, we can actually see this seam we marked around this ear. This is the surface of that ear stretched out and laid flat. We could clean up this map a little bit before we get started, which I would recommend. One thing we could do is kind of puff out these faces, and this is really where all this mesh is all centered up here. We don't need to adjust it too much because these faces are already pretty small and tight together, and we're not going to be like, putting a lot of detail into that ear probably. But what we could do is turn on proportional editing, press enable, then we could shift scroll down for vertex selection and select a few vertex points here, press S to scale, and then scroll our mouse wheel down so that this is not so huge. And we could just pick some points here and just kind of scale this up some so this map isn't just quite so jumbled together, and just adjust the size of the proportional edit with our scroll wheel, and maybe use face selection for some of this and what have you. just so it's not so super badly bunched together. Press S to scale these up here. Move some of these around a little bit, just get them a little less tight. Also, anywhere you notice that the map is overlapping itself, that's bad. So we don't want, for instance, where this edge was overlapping this edge here. That's not good. Anywhere you see that, you want that not to be the case, and so on. The other thing going on here is that we're definitely going to be putting the most detail in the face. However, the face part of the UV map is pretty small, whereas the whole back part of the head that got unwrapped is pretty big. So we could switch this back to island selection, select this big part of the head, which not a lot of detail is going into that. Before we scale this, let's go ahead and turn proportional editing off by pressing disable, because we don't want this to include anything around it. So we could press S to scale, bring this down a bit, and maybe rotate these around, put them somewhere. Now you want to make sure too also that there's a little bit of area between these parts of the UV map, because what can happen is bleeding when you're painting or doing something. And if you're, say, painting on this part of this eye here that got unwrapped, and you accidentally get a little bit over here, it's going to show up on a part of the map you don't intend it to. So you want a little bit of space between these areas here. And then finally we can scale up this. Okay, so now we got a UV map for our monkey, but we still need to give it a material. So let's press tab to go back into object mode and press new. And we'll go ahead and call this monkey mat. And then under texture, let's also press new. And want to make sure we are on the material icon of the texture area, so we're not, giving a texture to the world environment or for a brush or something. If we click open mapping, we'll see we're already set to UV here, so we could go ahead and just select the UV map we just created. And under image, we could create a new image for this UV map. So we could press new, and let's change this color to white here. Let's give the image a name. We'll call it monkey image. And let's increase it from 1024 by 1024 to 2048 by 2048. Press OK. That'll create us a new image there. So now if we press tab to go back into edit mode, and in the image editor, we select the monkey image we just created. Now this image is associated with this map. And so before we go any further here, I'm noticing a lot of bunching of this UV map around the mouth and this nose. So let's go ahead and press space for face selection, and let's unbunch these up a little bit here because we don't want this messing up down the road. And let's turn on enable proportional editing. We can press S to scale this up a little bit, making sure that none of these edges overlap the others, or else things will look bad when we're painting later on. And maybe select these. Just want to get this a little less bunched together. Zoom in on this a little bit. Okay, that's a little less bunched there. And I'll go ahead and turn proportional editing off by pressing disable. Also, wouldn't be a bad idea to select the island selection button and click on these eyes and maybe increase these and move them a bit away from each other so that the image doesn't accidentally bleed over from one part of the UV map to another. And we can just put some distance between these as well. All right, cool. So you notice that when we created this new image down here for this UV map we made, that it creates this little asterisk by where it says image. And whenever you see that, that means that the image you are using has not been saved or is not packed into the file, which means it can be lost. And thus warning the user saying, hey, something needs to be done about this image. So if we're going to be editing this externally, we're going to want to save this generated image we created to disk somewhere. So to do that, we can press save as image here and choose a location such as our desktop. Although ideally, if you're working on a project, you're going to want to save this image in a folder where the actual blend file is so they can all be kept together. But for now, we'll just save it on the desktop, no big deal. We'll go ahead and save it as type of PNG is fine, press save as image. And now the asterisk goes away, meaning, okay, phew, the image file has been saved, so everything's good. So right now we could paint on this in Blender by switching this from view to paint. We could paint directly on here if you press T to bring up your tool shelf. If you have the full version of ZeroBrush, then you'll have access to your ZeroBrush paintbrush options in the image editor, the same as you do in the 3D view. But if you have the light version, you should just see Blender's default paint tools here. So we could, paint around these eyes or something. And if we come down here to our 3D view, we can see these going on here live as we paint them. Or the nose or something. And if you have the full version of ZeroBrush, you can select this brush menu. And this is the Seamless Elemental Sample Brush Pack we downloaded in the last video. You could select this fabric knotted wool here. And, paint this around the eyes, the nose. Or we could pretty much just paint this all over. If we wanted to make this darker, we could change this from mix to multiply here, or we could just bring down the actual intensity of the color. We could press Shift X to decrease the strength, or increase it and just, make it darker around these eyes or something. Maybe make the nose super black. And maybe make the mouth more reddish, so we can see down here. So we have the option to paint on the image there, or go ahead and press T to dismiss my tool shelf here. We can export this into GIMP or Photoshop or whatever and work on it there. So to do that, what we would do is come down here where it says image, and you see the asterisk on there because we made changes to it, so we could press save image there. Now, since we set up in the user preferences at the beginning of the video, if we press edit externally, whatever image editor that we chose will open and load this image. So now we can use Photoshop to do whatever we wanted to this. Say we wanted to put some filter on here, open the filter gallery, like this dry brush or something, press OK here. Or maybe we just wanted to use one of our Photoshop brushes on this. Something, who knows? Something like this or whatever. When we wanted that to show back up in Blender, we would just save this. You want to make sure you save it not as a Photoshop, but as the same type that you opened it as. So you could just press File, Save. And after that's saved, back in Blender, in the texture panel under the image menu, you can press this refresh button, which will reload the newly edited image. And now we can see it here on the Suzanne model. If we wanted to have the actual UV map, if I press tab to go back in edit mode as a guide, we can export that and use that as well. So what we could do is change this from paint back to view. So we're back to where we can edit the UVs, and we get the UVs option here. And we can press export UV layout. So we would want to put this in the same location where we have that texture there. And we could just call this monkey UVs. Press export layout. And now back in Photoshop, we could just place this directly over this one. We could press file and place and click on the monkey UVs. And this will be placed directly over our other image here. So we could click this, press place here. And now we have this actual guide for the location of our UV map, such as the eyes here. So if I wanted to click on this layer here where we're actually editing this stuff and click on a brush and maybe change this brush to something like this. Maybe change this color to blue for the eyes or green or anything we want. We're gonna, do something like this for the eyes, maybe. And the scale of those eyes is a little different. We probably should have edited that UV map to where these eyes are the same size, but no big whoop. And maybe make this a bit brighter in some areas. And before we save this image, we would definitely want to hide the UV map layer, unless you want those lines showing up on your object, which you might look kind of cool. And once again, you want to make sure that you save this as a PNG, not as a PSD, because it won't reload back in Blender. If you do that, you have to save it as the same file type you opened it as, and that Blender is using that image as. So it's this PNG, so we would press File, Save. And if it tries to get you to save as a PSD, make sure you don't do that. And make sure you use the original file type and save back over that image there. And yes, okay, replace it. And now back in Blender, if we go ahead and press a refresh button here, we'll see our changes show up. So if we press tab to go back into object mode, here are these places where we drew over the eyes in Photoshop. So that's about it. Hope you have enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope it helps you understand using UV maps, exporting, editing images, and stuff like that a lot more. Of course, in addition to all these traditional methods, we have, if I press Alt-Z to switch over to material viewport shading, we have ZeroBrush itself, which we can use to directly paint onto objects as well, but we'll get into that in the future. So thanks for watching, and stick around for more.